Welcome to the Babblery, working, parenting, playing, voting, advocating, and creating as women. This is your host, Suki Wessling. When my father turned 90, I got him a gift of tickets to an event, a panel discussion about the history of winemaking in Santa Cruz County. My dad's a retired chemist who had been an amateur winemaker since I was a child. My own children and their cousins spent many happy years growing up on the property where he had a vineyard and small winemaking operation in the county. One of the speakers at the event was Prudy Fox, whose name I would have known had I paid more attention to professional winemaking before then. She's an important figure in the industry, having cast her focus on the land and the growing process, trying to bridge the gap that existed, and to her telling still persists, between the growing process in the vineyard and the winemaking process in the cellar. Not surprisingly, Prudy was the only woman on that panel that day. Winemaking in California, as in Europe, is dominated by male names on the bottles. In her comments, Prudy pointed out that there were other women who had been a dominant force in the early development of the wine industry in the county. That intrigued me. Prudy told me she knew enough women to do several podcasts, but this first one features two women who were there at the beginning, June Smith and Valerie Algren. Most histories of the region would feature their husbands as the winemakers and thus the center of attention, but like all histories that leave out the women, that history would be incomplete. We had a charming and wide-ranging conversation. Val, do you have any ideas that you came with?
Maybe a few, right?
Lack of ideas has never been my problem.
We laughed a lot.
Let's see, there was another thing I was thinking of, which of course I can't remember and will later. Well, the old Rolodex used to be much quicker than it is now, I will say. But that's life. And, being alive and losing memory is better than the alternative in losing everything.
Yeah.
Val, June, and Prudy's stories show a side to winemaking that the public seldom sees. The relationships, the struggles, and the fierce dedication to one of the oldest and most revered drinks that humanity has invented. We'll start with the story of Valerie and Dexter Algren, which features curiosity and taking a chance in a hard environment. Listen in.
I was teaching at De Anza Community College, and my department chairman was telling me about making wine. And I thought, oh my God, that sounds fabulous. Not too long after that, I decided that I was going to not teach anymore, that I was going to retire because I had 3 teenagers at home and a fairly spoiled 1950s style husband. And it was just grinding me down. And so when I stopped teaching, I still had this winemaking bee buzzing around in my brain. And I started fooling around at home. And one of my kids got a job at Wine Art. Remember them? She would, bring home this horrible concentrated juice. And it's just, we tried making wine and it was, unpalatable. And so I started fooling around with other things and including mead, sparkling mead. I made sparkling mead and it started to taste good. At which point Dexter gets interested. Well, it turns out he has this fabulous sense of smell and taste, which one of my kids also has too, one of my daughters. And he got really interested, and I thought, boy, this is my chance to get out of suburbia. And we started ultimately, a couple of years later, looking for property in the mountains and found. You hear my bird.
June gives herself less credit for the success of their winery, the Rudon Smith Winery. But like Val and her husband, June, along with her husband Jim and their partner Bob and his wife Ana Maria, were drawn to the relative youth of the wine industry in the Santa Cruz Mountains. The big names were mostly up in Napa and Sonoma, so there was still plenty of rugged, inhospitable land perfect for grapes, available in the Santa Cruz Mountains.
Talk about engineers. My husband, Jim Smith, actually was working at a company named Amdahl in Sunnyvale, and he needed to, it was a startup. So Bob Rudon, another engineer, applied. Bob wanted to come. He lived, I'm trying to remember where he lived, out of the area, but he wanted to move here because he was also a home winemaker. And he figured, he needed to get over here where it would be, he'd be able to continue his winemaking. But the thing is that the two of them worked so beautifully together, they started to dream together about starting a winery. And they were eventually able to do it. Bob was able to leave Amdahl before Jim and get things organized and find property. And then at that time, Jim was just like communicating with him back and forth, working part-time until he was able to retire from Amdahl. But they had stock options, and so that was what helped them to get established. So there were four of us, Bob and Anna Maria Rudon, Jim and I. And so Anna Maria did our graphic arts and our bookkeeping. Bob was the winemaker. Jim had been a farm boy from Wisconsin, so he was really good in many ways being an engineer, because we built a winery in Scotts Valley. And so then that left me to be, the public relations person and go out and pour wine. I didn't even drink wine at the time, but I did like being out in the community. So we all did what we loved for 31 years. And Bob was the first one who wanted to retire, because Jim and I had the tasting room at our property in Scotts Valley. And so it was easy for us. We could just, walk to the tasting room from where our house was. But Bob was interested in going to France and learning about, French winemaking. So he wanted to retire, and it was just that time. I still enjoy the camaraderie that we started. Yeah. Not too much more to tell.
There will be, of course, much more to tell in June's story once she gets going. A decade later, Prudy's path to wine was also not preordained. She started with an interest in agriculture, but also with a passionate focus on whatever she came across. Unlike June and Val, Prudy made her way into wine on her own, but later we'll hear about the amazing coincidence that made her own marriage seem fated through wine.
There was this little organic hippie farm basically on the college grounds, and I ended up, like I tend to do, getting all in. And so I'm very focused. And there's a thing in one of my physics classes. They showed the narrower the slit that you shine a beam of light through, the broader the spectrum of color on the other side. And that's always been kind of a theme in my life, why I get so focused on specific things, because I find the more I learn about just one thing, the more there is to know about that one thing. And so I took a class in the environmental college called Hard Times, Hard Tomatoes, and it was agricultural economics. And it was about how that was early genetic engineering. It wasn't really, I guess it was gene modification then, or it might have just been hybridizing, where they created these tomatoes that were great for packing and shipping, but tasted horrible and had no nutritional content. And so that got my attention, and probably is what started me down the organic path. Plus the sauna and cold plunge that was there on the farm. I liked that a lot. And anyway, I never could quite fit in with the hippies because I'm just too straight. I'm just too science oriented, and I come from a family of intellectuals who demand that I back up whatever I'm saying. And so I ended up having a major, I called it environmental communication, and it combined environmental science, chemistry, biology, theater, and writing. And I remember when I had, it was kind of like the college, when you wrote your own major, you had to defend it, kind of like in higher education. So I had to meet with all the faculty staff at the college and defend what the degree was about, to prove that it was a legitimate degree, and back it up with classes and credits and all that kind of thing. And I remember one of the women who was on the committee that reviewed my stuff, who had always wanted me to get into women's studies more, to learn my power, but I was too busy running everything. Take a class in it. Anyway, she was on the committee, and I remember when she looked at my paper and my defense, she goes, environmental communication. She said, "What's that? Talking to bees?" But then right out of college, my first job was at a place called Mount Baker Vineyards, where a friend of mine was a Davis graduate and had come back to Washington and was the winemaker there. And I thought it was an interesting work, and I made wine also as a hobby during my college years. And and we made these dry fruit wines. We'd take cherries or raspberries or local fruit or plums, plum crazy, we called it, and make it as dry as possible. That was always our goal, super dry wines, because most people who make a fruit wine make it very sweet. He said, "Why don't you come work at the winery?" So I did. And how it worked was I was landscaping. That's what it was. And he said, "Come work at the winery one day, see how you like it." So I did. And then he goes, "Well, go check out the vineyard." So I went out and worked in the vineyard just for a day, checking it out. I met the owner, Al Stratton. I worked a day, and then I went back to my job, and Al saw me the next day, and he said, "Why didn't you come to work today? I don't put up with flakes. You're fired." He yelled at me for not coming to work. And his last words, he goes, "You're fired." And I looked at him, and I saw, and I said, I waited for him to finish yelling at me. And then I said, "Well, Al, that's really too bad that you fired." I said, "But you can't really fire me." And he's like, "Why not?" And I said, "Well, I don't work for you. I was actually just volunteering that day to see what it was like. And I was actually going to ask you for a job, but maybe this is a bad time." You know? And he goes, and I'll never forget his Adam's apple just went kaboom. And then he goes, He goes, "Well, want a job?" So we actually became really good friends because everyone was afraid of this guy, but I never was afraid of him because I kind of got the worst of it out of the way.
Going back to the 70s, the three couples found that running small wineries on rugged land wasn't easy, but it became the most important work they'd done in their lives.
We started buying grapes. We bought the first commercial crop from Bates was our beginning. And also Mary Edwards, who was then the winemaker at Mount Eden, got us in on a load of Chardonnay from Ventana. And so those were our very first two wines. And we actually kept making those both for 40 years.
That's amazing.
Really exciting. Yeah, it's really exciting.
And then Dexter he was a civil engineer, and he was able to work from home because he had this established clientele right over the hill, in Silicon Valley. And so he was able to keep engineering so that we could put food on the table and continue building this house. And we milled the wood with an Alaska mill, and it was designed by Sim Vanderen, who was a terrifically environmentally oriented architect and was the state architect under Jerry Brown, and later the head of the department at Cal Berkeley. And at any rate, it all worked out. I loved gardening, and I spent a lot of time. Finally, in 2000, we planted some vines. We planted Pinot Noir, as Prudy knows, in a difficult situation. We only had 1 acre there. The land was so steep, and we had this water problem. And we had the only authorized alternative water system in the county, and we ran completely on rainwater. And as a result of the lawsuit against the well driller, not for not paying water, but for lying to us, we had enough money to pay off the attorneys and bought the biggest water tank we could afford, which is a 125,000 gallon bolted steel tank, just like the water district has.
Uh-huh.
And so planting much of a vineyard, and these vines were only irrigated to get them established, but it still takes water, and you can't haul water to grow a vineyard. At least that was our position, and I don't think it's permitted even now.
Because as I said, we each had the perfect job. Anna Maria with the graphics and the bookkeeping, Bob as the master winemaker, Jim as the farmer, who was also the two engineers. I mean, there's almost nothing that they couldn't do. They built our winery position where we were in Scotts Valley. And then I loved public relations already and writing. So that just worked so well. I mean, other times maybe that partners wouldn't have that kind of, relationship, but felt like a family.
I loved all of it. A winery to me is like an extension of the kitchen, without fire, without heat. And ours was a very small. We operated on 1,200 square feet of winery space, which, and a little addition. We could, and we started out with 10 barrels, and gradually in the main part of the winery, we had 199. I always thought we should have 200, but Decker said no. He needed that little bit of room for moving around. And we had an adjacent cellar room that was built under a porch, and that would hold about 30 barrels. So these were no barrel racks, everything, barrels on barrels with chocks between them. So we got as many in there as we could, and then did everything. All the winemaking and the fermenting was done outside, and with open top tanks for the red wines. And the whites we made, Semillon and Chardonnay, were fermented right in the barrel. So we didn't have refrigeration. We had natural cooling for the cellar. It always stayed, the wines always stayed at 55 to 60 degrees. And I took enough temperatures in barrels to feel like a proctologist at one point. But so that it was a very small operation and very dedicated to traditional winemaking systems, because that's what matched our personalities. As Prudy pointed out, there's no property for it. Santa Cruz is the second smallest county in the state of California. Not only that, it's steep. Much of the land is very steep. Much of it is wooded. Much of it is state parks. So there isn't very much available. I mean, our property at its maximum, before we sold off part of it that we weren't using, was 16 acres. But there are no large parcels. With Dexter's engineering practice, one of the things he was doing was running a survey crew. And he said, I keep backing up against my last survey. There's not expansive property.
It's not economical to grow wine grapes in Santa Cruz.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
That's why it was impossible for us to really sell our property to a commercial winemaker.
So I work with people who grow their own wine grapes, and I help them grow the best grapes they can in the highest quality. And it's interesting to convince people why they need a consultant. That was something that I was just going to add, that wine grapes is one of the oldest forms of agriculture. Vitis vinifera is a complete survivor. I mean, grapes are designed to take over the world. We'll be long gone.
They're weeds. They're wonderful weeds.
Exactly. They root so many different ways. Yeah. And if you drop a stick on the ground and it's wet enough, it'll root itself. Whenever anyone asks me to put in a vineyard, I always ask them first, I say, bring your partner. If you have one, bring your partner. I want to see everybody who's going to be involved in this and make sure you're all on the same page. Because lots of people are like, well, I'm going to retire. I think I want to do this for fun. And I'm like, it's not really fun. There's lots of times it's not fun at all, and it's a lot more work than you think. And then also, just under, and almost everyone says, well, I just want to break even, but there's some years you don't break even. And it just, especially the smaller the vineyard, the harder it is to break even. The reality is, because there's just so many more edges.
Welcome back to the Babblery. We are speaking with 3 women involved in the early history of winemaking in the Santa Cruz Mountains: June Smith, Valerie Algren, and Prudy Fox. Wine has been made since before written history. But for most of wine's history, people drank whatever they got, blaming the gods, the weather, terroir, or perhaps just plain bad luck if the product wasn't great. As she consulted with growers and vintners, Prudy realized that she had to take a new approach to improving wine, using science and testing rather than trusting history and tradition.
It's true that they do kind of grow themselves, but if you know about it a little bit, you can cultivate it to the point where you get something even more special than what it will do naturally. And what I've found is that people who get into viticulture or into growing vineyards, they're like, well, I can do that myself. Why do I need a consultant? And it's true, they will always get grapes, but I can't tell you how many vineyards I've been brought into where the winemaker was taking care of the vines and he's boasting that he gets a ton per acre. So the low yields are why his wines are so great. And the truth is the low yields are because the other 3 tons he didn't get and should have gotten are full of powdery mildew or some other problem, or didn't set, or had some other problem because he or she didn't, mostly he, didn't understand really how to take care of those grapes. And my whole thing is following the wine. I really believe in growing wine, not just grapes, but always, I call it, anybody I work with, we always take it all the way to the wine. We aren't necessarily winemakers, but we always meet with the winemakers and follow up. And if they have a fast fermentation or a slow fermentation or a stuck fermentation, or there's residual sugar or too much acid or not enough acid, all these things can relate back to the vineyard. And so I make sure that there's a really strong relationship there. And that's been an interesting journey.
Vineyard owners can be vandals.
It's challenging.
It's interesting the tension between the winemakers and the vineyard owners and then Prudy, in your case, you're the go-between, I guess.
The liaison. Well,
Yeah.
I've had to sort of defeat this idea, at least in Santa Cruz. And I've run through this all my whole career through Davis, and all the continuing education I've done is this idea that, and it's not like this in Europe, but in this country, they still treat vineyards, many people, and this is, I think, the kind of frustration that Val's expressing, is that they are trying to be farmers who get the maximum profit from the fruit. And so in that case, when you do overwater and overfertilize and overspray a vineyard, you can increase the quantity that way, but you will impact the quality. But that doesn't mean that taking care of your vineyard will impact the quality negatively. It just means that if you farm it, that's why I actually don't like the term farming, because to me, farming is all these inputs to maximize quantity and yield. Whereas what I like to do is maximize cultivation and growing. I mean, that's why I like agriculture. It's a culture. Right, viticulture, it's cultural. That's really what you're doing, and that the inputs are minimized at all times, so that you're helping the grapes to do the best they can without forcing steroids on them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, essentially, you're managing the soil.
Yeah, exactly. You really are. And the vines, well, there's a cultural side. I mean, there's canopy work that we do. Yeah,
but
that's also important.
Like I have a friend who is emerita now, but she was a professor of soil science at Davis, and she did a really sophisticated soil test on our little hilltop, and cultured it and did all this stuff. And she said she had expected to find an old farmland, and yet it came up. It had so much fiber in it, so many microorganisms. She said,
Exactly.
if you dig this, if you plow this, you will burn up all of the organics in the soil, and you'll have like hard pan. So we never dug anything except the holes to put the vines in.
Right.
And we had a very carefully selected cover crop with clovers and zorophicaceae, and we just mowed it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so we never used any fertilizer ever.
Right.
And I don't know, it's a whole attitude thing, you know.
It is. When I give vineyard tours, I say we're only looking at half the vineyard when you're looking at the grapevines, because the other half of the vineyard is under the soil, is the soil. And I wish I'd had that soil scientist teacher professor, because my soil teachers were all about, there's nitrogen, there's phosphorus, there's potassium. They just broke down all the chemical elements of soil when I was in college, and they never talked about the microorganisms, the life force of the soil, which is actually what soil is all about.
Right.
And they recognize that now, but at the time it was just this inert medium.
Like hydroponics, but they just held the vines in place.
Right. And you did things to it. They were always telling you what to do, how
Yeah.
much nitrogen to add, how much this, how much that. And you're just like, wait a minute.
Well, you know, I was fascinated because when we planted the vine, you know, we used a hole driller, and it comes out, it looks like the inside of a clay pipe.
Uh-huh.
And then you plant the vine. And when a vine would have to be replaced, I'd go there and it was all this friable soil, you know. Everything that was there got back to work and broke down the holes, the casing around the hole, and just made it all this lovely stuff. In the summer, when it's dry, it goes dormant, and it seems like just nothing. And my soil here, well, what happened was I stopped digging in my garden, because my garden soil was nothing like the vineyard soil. Stopped digging altogether, only made holes to put seeds or plants in, and everything improved. And here, this soil in Felton, my same friend who's now retired, she says, well, this thing is classified as the best agricultural soil in the state of California. And in the summer, it's like hydrophobic. You can hardly get water to soak in. It's almost like powder. The minute the water hits it, the rain hits it, it comes alive.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a remarkable experience.
Not involved in the winemaking herself, June cast her attention to the people around her and noticed something important. I'm interested in why you thought that at the time that you should write about the women winemakers. What was it that attracted you or attracted your notice about women in the wine industry?
Number one, I was one of them, so I should be interested. But it was editing that Shannon's letter that got me realizing that we had a lot of stories, and also because since I was a Sentinel correspondent as a travel writer, and there were no more trips to write about, I thought, well, I got to keep this going. So I just got the idea that just think of all the stories there that I could tell about the wineries, the people. In fact, I don't know as much about wine as most of you. I like publicizing Santa Cruz Mountains because not everybody knew that we were one of the premier wine growing regions, and I wanted to get that word out. So I started writing for Examiner.com, but I asked Jerry Starr, but I asked him if he would be a co-writer, and that would be a perfect partnership because he could talk and describe about the wine. I could talk about the people. So that I think we did that for about 6 years. It's just that I am a writer, so I write, and whatever there is to write about, I'm going to write about it. But especially if it's something I know about. I think most of the winemakers were men, but the women were the women behind the men. There's a lot. Most of us know the women behind the men have a lot of power. Val, can you kind of help me to understand how I can?
Well, I never thought about women in wine. I just, I was married to my partner and we had a business, and he was good at all the sensory stuff, and he had great common sense, and he needed an assistant if he was going to have a winery, and I became that person, and I did all the cellar work for years, and because he was upstairs making money, with the drafting table. This was pre-computers. We really worked well together. I just think that the winery was a blessing. It was so different than when I would go off to campus and he would go off to his engineering office, and we came together in the evenings, and we were buddies and all that. But when we had the winery, it was nonstop. Everything was integrated, and of course we lived right there. And ultimately, me being me, I got involved in the politics.
One thing I was going to, before I forget, when we were talking about the women behind the men, Beverly Bargetto is who inspired me. Because, back when we started, there weren't that many wineries. And so she was,
right.
Bargetto was big. I mean, Bargetto and David Bruce were the ones that you had already heard of, not Rudon Smith and so forth. Yeah, so that's why I was inspired to start writing about the women.
Running a winery is a passion, and you can't expect everybody to have it. And it's a lifetime dedication. I mean, one thing about being in the wine business that's fascinating is people, and their children, and their grandchildren. And that doesn't happen a whole lot in this day and age, because winemakers tend to stay put. If they own a winery, they stay put, and they become a part of the community. And it's very different. I grew up in San Francisco, and we knew maybe a half dozen families within a 3-block radius. And I was fascinated when I moved to Boulder Creek that when you spoke, people knew who said it. You're not anonymous when you're in a small community or in a small professional community, which winemaking was. When we started our winery, there were only 300 wineries in all of California.
I totally agree with Val in that the wine industry on the small business level, especially when I got involved, is a passion. It's an addiction. You're all in. I mean, just like both June and Val. I mean, the reason I even know them is because they were all in when I got started, and they were so passionate with what they were both doing. I found both of you and June and Val as incredibly inspirational and fun, because fun is a big priority in my life. And they made it fun, and it was a community, but also had that just incredible passion to make the best wine and grow the best wine, and everybody had their input. For me, coming at it from the point of view of the vineyard has always been somewhat of a challenge to be sort of accepted in the community. Not so much by Val and June, but honestly, the men. So many of the men that I dealt with, not all of them, but so many were so focused on the wine that the vineyard often just got in my world got seemingly taken for granted almost. I mean, they took it seriously and they knew it was hard work, but I didn't meet people who saw the vineyard as this living birth of the wine kind of guy. I'm so literal when they say wine comes from the vineyard. That's why I went in the vineyard, was to figure out why that was the case. And it took about 35 years later, one day I woke up and went, wow, I think I got it. And, but that was after like taking class. I mean, when I took classes in Burgundy and Bordeaux, that's when it really brought it together for me, because in Burgundy and Bordeaux at the universities there, they teach wine and viticulture as a seamless process. And at Davis, they teach it you either take viticulture or you take winemaking, and never the twain shall meet. And the viticulture people are pretty much ignored as farmers that for some reason have no respect and are thought of as less intelligent for some reason. And so there's a lot of stereotypes, the least of which was being a woman. That was like, with all the other stereotypes, being a woman barely crossed my mind. But and also I have a low voice, and so I mean all kinds of funny things would happen. I remember I ordered a trellis system for a vineyard, and the trucker shows up and he drives in, and I climb up onto the side of the semi to talk to him through the window, and he's looking at this piece of paper. He goes, "I'm looking for a Mr. Prudy." And I was like, okay, you got her.
Winemaking is not without its politics. Right away, June and Val realized that small wineries were not going to make it on their own. They formed an association which still thrives today. According to an article June wrote for the Santa Cruz Sentinel, the association applied for federal recognition from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. This was to become the first American viticultural area in the United States to use the European model of defining borders, based on climate, altitude, and viticultural ability rather than political boundaries created by county lines. But just as the Santa Cruz Mountains appellation has grown significantly, the wineries have also changed.
For my part, I started out, well, we started the Santa Cruz Wine Growers Association. It was the Santa Cruz County Wine Growers Association. There were a few of us, David, Bruce, Bargetto, just a few. I guess Val was maybe you too, but I don't know if you remember that part.
Yeah, there were 13 members originally.
Thank you.
13 wineries in the Santa Cruz Mountains at that point.
Yeah, I was trying to look that up. Thank you.
What year would that have been?
Well, we started in 72.
I'm trying to think. I knew that just recently, but my brain has all these holes, everything keeps falling out.
Join the club.
I think you guys were talking about having the dinner around 74 or 76 when you were just doing dinners.
It was about 76.
More informal. I don't know when it formalized.
Well, that was just a party. I don't think anybody.
All the best organizations start with a party, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but what started as the Santa Cruz County Wine Growers Association ended up into the Santa Cruz Mountains.
Yes.
And however many we had, then we kept adding on.
There was a big fight at one point going on about taxing wine and taxing wineries. And I did a big analysis of that and got quoted in newspapers because I worked out that for a winery our size, the tax was going to be something like $8 a bottle because it didn't, parts of it didn't recognize that Algren Vineyard was a little different from Gallo. And so the taxations were identical. And it took hold, and I got involved with the Wine Institute, and then working on issues like that. And then when Family Winemakers of California was formed, Dexter and I were invited, and we were on the founding board and shared a seat for 7 years. And that was interesting because we got to visit all of the wineries and, had a serious voice in the policies of the organization and all. The association now includes the whole county of Santa Cruz, whereas the appellation only includes the mountains. But the last time I looked, there were almost 70 or 72 wineries in that area, where there were 13. Plus, Bargetto was the only one that was outside. The whole thing has grown fantastically.
It's more just this expression that more and more, and now the association that these two wonderful women had a huge part in creating in the beginning as part of a community, now it's in the hands of pure marketers who have nothing to do with the production of wine. They do not work in wineries. They do not grow grapes. It's our strength that it's small winemakers and small vineyards, because that is so hands-on, and you really can count on getting wines of terroir, if you will, wines that really express where they're from, because it isn't a giant corporation throwing it in a 1,000-gallon tank and sulfiting the heck out of it. And so I think the people involved are still very dedicated.
Welcome back to the Babblery. We are speaking with three women involved in the early history of winemaking in the Santa Cruz Mountains: June Smith, Valerie Algren, and Prudy Fox. Women's lives are not lived in isolation, of course. Our choice of partners, whether or not to have children, and the work we do affects us deeply. It struck me in our conversations that June and Val, two women who married in a male-dominated time, seemed to have full partnerships with their husbands. Both women's wineries would not have started without this partnership.
I mean, I was ready because, you do have relationships, and for one reason or another, they're not the one. I mean, maybe you try it out. And I had a few serious relationships, but maybe it was because I was 25, 26 that then I knew I was ready, because I guess I wasn't ready before.
And maybe the men weren't the right ones.
Yeah, that's true. Right.
What was it about him that you felt was right?
Boy, you are making me go really back. Well, I found out he liked to travel. I think that's one of the first things, because as soon as I knew that fact, and also he liked to dance. I met him at a church dance. So there were two really important things right there. And then we just, we had that spark too. I mean, you can't dismiss that spark that's there. If it's there, it's there. If it's not, it's not. We were lucky that we did get a lot of traveling done before we got deep into winemaking. And then I was ready to just do whatever, as a partner. The only thing I had was the family, and raised the family actually while we were doing this, but we did get a chance, called on my mother to let us go on some trips, because we love to travel. But it was just that when you're a partner, you're a partner. And I thought it was exciting, because when it turned out that between the four of us, I could do the thing that I was best at, and that was community relations. I was in the Rotary Club, and I don't remember what else I was involved in, but so when you're out among people, it's really easy to publicize your winery.
Well, how about you, Val? How do you feel that your relationship was part of what you did with wine?
It was an integral part of our relationship because we were partners, although it's interesting to hear June say that Jim had been in the Army and all of that, because Dexter had too, was behind in college because of that. So when I met him, I was 19 and he was 23. He wanted to get on with being a grown-up, and I wasn't at all ready. I'd been at Berkeley for, I guess, a full year before I met him. And we just clicked. And we were married 6 months after we met and finished that last semester together. I went back to school when I was 30 and completed my BA at San Jose State, and then commuted for 2 years from Sunnyvale to Berkeley to do a master's program, and then was teaching at De Anza. When we started the winery, designing the house and building the house, we milled the wood with an Alaska mill from logs we bought from a neighbor. It was it was a craft project. We were just so into it, and there were so many problems to be solved, and then the water problem, and then, on and on. And like June said, we each had tasks that we were very well suited to. For me, writing was a big thing, as it is for June, and also art, creative stuff. And I did the newsletter, and I just love that. And I love building that house. I mean, my hands literally were on every single board in that house. Why would an engineer give up his business and a teacher give up her career, quote, career, and move to a place in the mountains with a pile of wood they're going to make a house out of? You know, how do you add that up? But it added up perfectly for us.
Meanwhile, the women of Prudy's younger generation were more likely to put their careers first. Prudy's career developed apart from family and her eventual marriage. The story of meeting her husband Mark would be called an outrageous coincidence in a fiction workshop, but that's the odd way life happens sometimes.
It's funny because he's in the other room and he popped in. He goes, "Boy, I hope they don't ask you this." And so he was joking. All right. And so it is funny. I mean, I would say that, I mean, I was listening, you know, June, you said you were older. I was 31 when I got married. I moved from Washington. I really wanted something different in my life. I wasn't really thinking about getting married. Actually, but Mark and I, we have wine in common. We do. We both like good wine. And actually, when I invited him to my birthday party, when I had first met him, it's kind of indicative of so many funny things that happened to us. He showed up with this bottle of wine that he had actually lived in Washington also before and moved to Santa Cruz to go to get his master's. And so he brought up, and he knew that I was involved with wine. We actually met in Bonnie Doon Vineyard because he had a friend that lived there, and that's who introduced us, in fact. But they told me he was from Washington, so I had no interest in meeting him. I said, "I've already met Ned from Washington. I'm not interested in meeting another long-haired guy from Washington." So, but anyway, he showed up with a bottle of wine and he said, "This is some fruit wine that I got in Washington." And I was like, and he said, "It's a dry blackberry." I said, "Wow, that's really interesting. I used to make dry blackberry with my friends in Washington. I didn't know anybody else was really doing that." And he goes, "Well, I got it at a barter fair, blah, blah, blah." So I popped it open just casually. And the cork was a Mount Baker Vineyard cork, which means I made that wine like 5 years before. And I looked at it, and the funny thing about it was that I had brought with me that same wine, and it was in my garage. And where I lived at the time is when you came up the steps to get in the house, there was this the door to the garage was open, and the wine was just right inside of it. It was north facing, so it was just right around the corner of the door. And I thought, my God, is this guy so crass that he reached in my garage and grabbed a bottle of my wine? Because where else would he have gotten it, right? I mean, there were only like 12 cases or 25 cases in the world made. And so I was just so stunned that I go, where did you get this wine? And he looks at me and he goes, "Well, I got it in Washington." And I'm calling, my brothers were there, and I called my brothers in. I'm like, "Hey, you might need to take this guy out of the house because he's a thief," you know? And I was so shocked that I'm like, "Where did you get it?" And then like, "Where exactly? Which barter fair?" And there was a guy you traded for. What did he look like? And it turned out he was able to describe my winemaking partner, Brent, is who he had actually traded for this wine with like 3 years before. And he had no idea that I had anything to do with it at all. And it didn't have a label on it. So anyway, that was one of my very first experiences with Mark, is he brought me my own wine.
Small world,
Right.
world.
Yeah, from Washington. And so anyway, things went from there. And we also got married within a year, or agreed to get married within a year of meeting, or very close to that. I mean, I'm so ridiculous. I had this whole vision. I'm going to come get my residency, go to Davis, get my master's. I had this whole plan. And so when the first time Mark asked me to marry him, or was going to, he started it out saying, "Well, how do you see your future?" And I was like, "Well, I'm going to go to Davis. I'm going to get my master's. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that." And he's sort of like, "What about us?" And I'm like, "Well, we can fit it in. It'll all be fine." We got into a big argument. So I ended up not being proposed to that night. But fortunately, he gave me a second chance. And my family was horrified that I got into it. They couldn't relate to it. I come from Indianapolis. I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana. They were horrified. They don't call it agriculture. They call it farming, and it is not to be done by those people who are educated. They did not. They definitely saw it at the bottom of Plato's triangle and not because it was a foundation. I mean, it's funny. My family is very, very old family into genealogy. So there's several of the relatives put together long genealogy histories and books, which are wonderful to have. When I got my page, they couldn't understand what a viticulturist was. They just couldn't even pronounce it. They couldn't spell it. They just had never heard of it. So they said that I can't remember. They might have said viticulturist, but then they put in parentheses, in charge of the weather. which my husband still teases me about to this day. Whenever the weather gets funny, he's like, "Hey." I can't say it was in my family at all. But I think it's the love of science and just a practical side that I have that put me there. And my kids, my husband is a geotechnical engineer and designs seawalls. My oldest son is actually a nuclear scientist. My other son wants to drive heavy equipment and cleared our road this weekend. But none of them have any real interest in wine. They're young men. They like craft beers. We joke about it's all about the faults, right? Whose fault is it? Because if you're a geologist, faults are very important. And faults in wine are also a big issue for me. That I'm a specialist in faults. What's wrong with it is one of the things I had to learn first. I tend to be relatively independent, and fortunately, he's okay with that. He's pretty independent too, and he's really smart, and that helps me a lot. And I think that's one of the biggest things I value. Plus, he's a nice guy. He's happy.
Yes. I like the smarts too.
Yeah, comes in handy.
And Dexter, and I used to say we're like Rogers and Hammerstein. One of us did the numbers and one of us did the music. I did the words and Dexter did the numbers because I'm impossible with numbers. And but I'm really a really good writer, Yeah. And so those things all worked out really, really well. And I just realized this the last time I visited the people who now own, I still call it my mountain house. I grew up there. I mean, I grew up in a way that I had not grown up before. I kind of became myself because there were so many fundamental decisions that had to be made and had to be made with Dexter and had to be reasoned through and realities to be faced. I mean, unlimited opportunity to make your own mistakes, right?
I like that.
Because as I said, we each had the perfect job. Anna Maria with the graphics and the bookkeeping, Bob as the master winemaker, Jim as the farmer, who was also the two engineers. I mean, there's almost nothing that they couldn't do. They built our winery position where we were in Scotts Valley. And then I loved public relations already and writing. So that just worked so well. I mean, other times maybe that partners wouldn't have that kind of, relationship, but felt like a family.
Val and Dexter's winery, Algren Vineyard, struggled and then thrived for 40 years, 1976 to 2016. Because of the difficulties with developing the property, they largely depended on grapes purchased from Bates Ranch. Although their land is still being cared for by a private owner, the winery is no longer in operation. June and Jim's Rudon Smith Winery became a bigger operation, eventually producing 10,000 cases annually. The winery continues today, under new ownership. Val and June are no longer winemakers, but people don't put their bodies and souls into a business like winemaking and walk away unchanged. In this last segment of our discussion, Val talks at length about Dexter's illness, their decision to leave the house they had built together, and his death.
And then in 2000, Dexter had a stroke. He did a lot of work on recovering, but gradually he got all that back, working very hard at it. Our young daughter, Beth, it turns out she has this gift that Dexter has. And so she was our winemaker for a couple of years, and then it just became too much for her. She was commuting from Santa Cruz. She had a kid in high school. But Dexter and I really didn't have anyone to lead the winery to. And we just couldn't find a way to keep it going. And so in 2016, 16. At the end of the year, we put it to sleep. You know, when you get to be your late 80s, you really have to face some realities sometimes. And we had been, living on, I guess, fairy essence for 40 years. So we felt very fulfilled, and we were still living there. But when Dexter died, we had already made the decision to move to Felton. We had bought this house that I'm now in 2015, full well knowing we couldn't live on the mountain forever. And so I just went ahead and moved. So I think it's worked out really well. But the winery did not have a second life.
Since Jim's death, June has kept herself busy writing, dancing, and traveling. Prudy continues to work, focusing on the land, the vines, the people, and the wine that connects them all together. All three of them continue to live in the mountains that sustain their relationships, their wine, their friendships, and their careers.
In the meantime, I'm privileged to have a lifetime stash of old Auburn wines. I'm drinking these old wines,
That's lovely.
Yeah. Last night I had an 87 Bates Cab.
Yay.
And it was quite lovely,
I can no longer drink alcohol. It doesn't like me. So there's no reason to really stay involved with wine. But I have a great life. I mean, I've got family, dancing, travel sometimes, got to go to Sedona. I mean, I have a very full life that I'm happy with.
It's a real feeling of camaraderie. There's certain points, harvest, bottling, there's crush, there's certain times in this whole process that the communities, you can really bring people together and have a celebration, and it can be a wonderful sharing experience. I think that wine is, Val touched on this in June too, that wine is it's a full commitment. It's a lifestyle. It's a completely part of your life. It's not like going to a job that you come home from. Everything that happens, the weather is going to make you think about your wine, the sun, the light, the heat, everything that goes on, the people you meet. If you're a grower, then environmental issues might become a bigger issue, but a winemaker also is always going to be thinking about that. The winemakers, that in the people it's a lifestyle. With traveling, it does enhance traveling amazingly because it gives a focus to the travel. It is a lifestyle. It's a life's commitment. It's a journey, and it is also a great teacher. There's so many analogies that can be drawn that we've even talked about today. In the process of growing and making great wine is really like growing and making a great life.
Visit babblery.com for links and information about this podcast. The Babblery is produced with support from KSQD in Santa Cruz, California.